we proceed to the next presentation. Let me see. It looks like we're out of time, Judge, as well.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Judge, co-chair of this conference as well. It has been a lovely presentation, and I think you can see from the questions that the presentation was received well.
Yeah.
Thank you, Judge.
You're welcome, Sijvi.
All right. So now the next presenter, I'm actually going to be a little bit excited about this one. The next presenter is Dr. Enrico Colendro. I've spoken with him on 1 or 2 online conferences, and I've always appreciated the ICT perspective that he brings. He comes from a research institute called Research ICT Africa, and his topic is titled Observing Global Norms Nationally, the Case of a Critical Infrastructure Protection in South Africa. So I take it Dr. Colendro will be talking about the Critical Infrastructure Act that has been enacted recently. Dr. Colendro, are you here?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Advocate Snail, for the introduction, for the very nice introduction. And good morning, everyone. It's a big pleasure and honor for me to present during this conference. So thanks very much for inviting me. It is actually the first time for me. I will now share my screen because I have a presentation. I've got a few slides that will help me to present this. Is a working research paper, as you said, on observing global cyber norms nationally. And I've elaborated on the case of critical infrastructure protection in South Africa. Now, why did I'm working on this issue? I'm working on this issue because at the UN level, in the first committee, which deals with disarmament and responsible state behavior, also in cyberspace, a number of countries are discussing how international laws apply to cyberspace. And in 2015, they agreed on 11 norms on responsible state behavior to maintain peace and stability in cyberspace. And those norms are voluntary, non-binding for all member states. And the current discussion, which is in a forum called Open-Ended Working Group on ICT, is on operationalizing these norms nationally. So we are in a phase where there has been a global agreement on these norms. Some of them are related to the protection of the critical infrastructures. And so the discussions now are on how then can these norms be implemented nationally. So I decided then to develop a case study on South Africa, which seeks to answer these guiding questions. So what are the priorities and positions of South Africa in these debates at an international level, dealing with cyberspace? I try to understand to what degree are these priorities taken into account nationally. And also then I've tried to understand whether the technological policy and regulatory ecosystem is ready to tackle these emerging ICT threats and vulnerabilities. I think it's when you discuss these issues of responsible state behavior in the South African context, it's important to contextualize it to the national reality, basically, on ICT. And in South Africa, we have our research has shown that we have the so-called digital paradox. So I don't know, for instance, if we have a look at the South African Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan, very recent document to try to tackle some of the problems emerging from the COVID-19. The digital economy is considered a key enabler of the economic recovery phase, and similarly, that also actually in the for industrial revolution document and report. But at the same time, this increasing number of attacks to critical national infrastructure risk to jeopardize this effort, and also to entrench existing socioeconomic inequalities. In South Africa, as we know, there is an existent and persistent, I would say, digital divide. Also, an increasing number of people are able to connect to their mobile phone, but there are questions on meaningful connectivity and if that's actually is enough. Together with that, there is also an increasing, it seems, security gap between those that are able to understand cybercrime, they're able to protect against it. They've got tools, maybe they've got updated machines, softwares, they're able to upgrade their devices, and those that instead are not aware of cybercrime and so are completely left somehow without or very little position. South Africa is also ahead of many sub-Saharan African countries in fight against cybercrime. For this research, I've conducted a number of interviews with experts, national experts in this field, and many of them actually recognize that South Africa has clusters of excellence to fight cybercrime. But at the same time, there is an increasing number of attacks to critical national infrastructure, which somehow is concerning. So, for instance, according to Kaspersky, malware attacks increased by 22% in Q1 2019 in comparison to Q1 2018. And here I just list a few cyber attacks that were experienced between 2019 and 2020. There is the City Power, which is a big electricity supplier in South Africa, owned by the city of Johannesburg. In July 2019, fell victim of a ransomware attack. A few months later, in October 2019, the city of Johannesburg was held for ransom, as I believe you all remember. Sabrik, in their latest report on digital banking fraud, reported that the magnitude of loss from bank-related digital crime in 2019 was 713 million rands. More recently, in February 2020, Nedbank alerted that the information of approximately 1.7 million of clients was potentially affected by a data breach. Similarly, other companies affected by data breach were Omnia Holdings, which is a chemicals and fertilizer maker. And probably also you all remember the case of Life Healthcare Group, because it actually happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. That company was hit by cyber attack as well. And in June 2020, Telkom fell victim to a group, to a ransom attack as well from a group called Revil. And more recently, probably you all remember, then in August 2020, Sabrik announced that Experia, this consumer business and credit information services agency, handed over the information to a suspected fraudster, and exposing personal banking information of 24 million South Africans and almost 800,000 businesses. So those are some of the challenges that basically South Africa is trying to tackle at the moment related to critical infrastructure protection. But let's see how the issue is tackled at the UN level from a UN perspective. So in 2003, there has been this United Nations General Assembly resolution number 4899 on the creation of a global culture of cybersecurity and the protection of critical information infrastructure. When member states noted that there was an increasing links amongst most countries' critical infrastructures and the critical information infrastructures that actually connects them all at the moment, meaning that basically the information infrastructure is the technical underpinning for the operation of national critical infrastructures. And that resolution made a number of recommendations on the protection of the critical infrastructures and on reporting of vulnerabilities, including the establishment of emergency warning networks regarding cyber vulnerabilities, threats, and incidents. And recommended to promote public-private partnerships to prevent, investigate, and respond to damage or to attacks, and to facilitate the disclosure of tracing information to other states, and to engage in international cooperation by developing and coordinating emergency warning systems, sharing and analyzing information regarding vulnerabilities, threats, and incidents, and coordinating investigations of attack. Subsequently, with the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 64/211, member states expressed concern over the growing sophistication and gravity of threats to the reliable functioning of critical information infrastructures and to the integrity of the information carried over those networks. And more recently, in 2015, the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 70/237, member states welcomed and recognized the applicability of the international law in cyberspace, and particularly the UN Charter, to maintain peace and stability and to promote an open, secure, stable, accessible, and peaceful ICT environment. That report acknowledges also that the most harmful attacks using ICTs include those targeted against the critical infrastructure. And as I said, through this set of voluntary, non-binding norms, rules, and principles on responsible state behavior, they explicitly requested to identify ways to protect the critical infrastructures. And they agreed that a state should not conduct or knowingly support ICT activity that are contrary to its obligations under international law, that intentionally damages critical infrastructure or otherwise impairs the use and operation of critical infrastructure to provide services to the public. And more importantly, it's also that states should take appropriate measures to protect their critical infrastructures from ICT threats. Again, in the UNGA resolutions, the most recent one, the 2015 report, which is the one that is actually under discussion at the open-ended working group, and so the one that should be operationalized at the national level. There is also an emphasis on providing assistance and training to developing countries to improve the security of their critical infrastructure. So emphasis is placed on cyber capacity building and also on facilitating cross-border cooperation to address critical infrastructure vulnerabilities. So there is a recognition that somehow there is a need of improving cooperative aspects between states as well. And Norm J, which is on responsible reporting of ICT vulnerabilities, basically recommends that this responsible reporting is an international process whereby a state entity encourages stakeholders to responsibly report vulnerabilities. And also information about remedies describes an external process, on the other hand, whereby states exchange information or readiness. And vulnerability disclosure is also considered a confidence building measure, which is another important component of the report, which basically recommends to increase transparency between states by exchanging informations also on vulnerabilities, just to keep, let's say, the overall environment in cyberspace more peaceful. So one way, called confidence building measures, it's really based on this, on sharing of information between different states. And there are a number of best practices, or let's call them good practices, on sharing on vulnerability, on reporting on vulnerability, responsible reporting. I mentioned a few of them in my papers because I think that South Africa and maybe also private sector organizations can actually draw from them. There is, for instance, the NISA report on good practice guide on vulnerability disclosure. And there has been also a recent joint research center of the European Commission's study on the vulnerability disclosure process, where basically the emphasis is placed on third-party security researchers to discover zero-day vulnerabilities, which are very, very important. Actually, they play an important role for the identification of these vulnerabilities. And another good practice on responsible vulnerability disclosure is represented by the Vulnerability Disclosure Program for Online Systems, which is a framework by the Cybersecurity Unit, Computer Crime, and Intellectual Property Section Criminal Division of the US Department of Justice. Is a 2017 document. And also the National Cybersecurity Center in the Netherlands published guidelines for responsible disclosure. Last but not least, there are guidelines and recommendations to provide legal clarity for software vulnerability discovery and disclosure defined by ISO IC. There are two standards that can be taken into account. Those are the 2947 of 2014, and then the standard 30111. So, but then how does this body of norms on critical infrastructure protection and reporting of ICT vulnerabilities translate in the context of South Africa? So South Africa in the UN processes is a relatively active actor. Because since 2019, is chairing the Bureau of the Open-Ended Intergovernmental Expert Group to conduct a comprehensive study on cybercrime. And in 2020, chaired the 6th session, which deliberated on two important issues, namely international cooperation to fight cybercrime and prevention. So it's really leading that process at the Intergovernmental Expert Group of the UN ODC. It's also involved with the Group of Governmental Experts, which is a group of countries that apply to become part of it. They are part of the first committee of the UN dealing with disarmament. And South Africa is part of that group since the beginning. So the works of that group started in 2004 and 2005. And then was the only African representative in the second GGE in 2009 and 10, and now it's part of the 6th GGE with other African countries, including Mauritius and Kenya. But recently, since last year, South Africa is part of the Open-Ended Working Group, which is this expanded group of countries, which include also the private sector, and that are discussing primarily how to implement the recommendations done in 2015. South Africa aligned itself with the Non-Aligned Movement, which is a group of states. South Africa made a number of statements on tackling the issue of gender disparities in ICT access and use, but also on cyber crime and cybersecurity issues. Have made some comments on the fact that that confidence building measures should be tackled at sub-regional and regional levels. So, calling for the SADC to actually have a leading role on that as well in this region, and of course the EU. And express some concerns on stockpiling of ICT-related vulnerabilities. Similar concerns were actually expressed also by the private sector in the past, and especially by Microsoft, with instead an invite to actually disclose these vulnerabilities. And the long-term view of South Africa includes binding instruments to international law. So it's actually also recommending to have binding instruments in future, or to work towards them. Okay, some jurisdictional considerations on the protection of critical infrastructure. So information infrastructures are subject to territorial jurisdiction. So state should identify what infrastructures are important and are considered critical because they fall under their own jurisdiction. And they should resolve their functioning, sustainability, and safety within their territory. So it's somehow their responsibility. That can be done through national regulations on the protection of the infrastructures. And that's linked also to the concept of sovereignty. So, there is a responsibility somehow at the national level to ensure security of information systems. So, cybersecurity governance framework should have a coordinating body to do that. And there is a need for a dedicated and comprehensive critical infrastructure protection framework. This framework should establish partnerships with a number of critical infrastructure stakeholders, because critical infrastructure and specifically information infrastructure are not always owned by state entities. In fact, the contrary is true. They are privately owned, but not only information infrastructures, also other kind of critical infrastructures are privately owned. It is important, as we have just seen, recommended also by the 2015 report, this collaboration with a number of international partners. And what is very important is also to build trust between the public and private sector, especially for the sharing of information. Because if there is no trust between these two actors, there won't be any sharing of information, and there won't be any responsible disclosure of vulnerabilities. So that's very, very important. Now, let's see what is happening at the national level. What's the context nationally? So it seems that overall, national critical infrastructures are not yet adequately protected in South Africa. Also, some kind of legislation for the protection of the physical infrastructure exists. It can't use to protect computer systems. For instance, the 2002 Electronic Communications and Transaction Act caters only for the protection of databases, but not for other ICTs. And there is no provision to implement minimum security standards. The national cybersecurity policy framework, which is, I would say, now a relatively old document because it's a 2014 document, it seems a little bit vague in establishing roles and responsibilities for the critical national infrastructure operators. And the state security agencies got the responsibility of developing this national critical information infrastructure policy. But the status of that draft is unknown, or at least is not publicly available. I couldn't find information publicly available on the web on that. There is, in the policy framework, there should be also a national critical infrastructure strategy. It should be drafted, but the status as well, it seems unknown. And a national critical information infrastructure plan under the Justice, Crime Prevention, Security Cluster, Cybersecurity Response Committee has got similarly an unknown status. The Cybersecurity Center has some responsibility in terms of protecting or of reporting somehow. People can voluntary reporting on vulnerabilities or on attacks to critical infrastructure, but it seems that that center unfortunately is under-resourced. And also no formal mechanisms between government agencies and owners of critical infrastructure assets for collaboration exist. Most of them seems that they are primarily informal. The cybercrime bill, also as mentioned by Dr. Sladi, does not deal any longer with the national critical information infrastructures protection. Now, to obviate to that problem, there is now a critical infrastructure protection bill. But the bill seems to have a broad definition, which include also a national critical information infrastructure. So also it seems it doesn't clearly state them. It calls for the establishment of a critical infrastructure council. And the act gives the Minister of Police the discretion to declare certain critical infrastructures as critical, and prescribes how these are protected in the interest of national security. And a person in control of infrastructure can apply to have some infrastructure designated as critical infrastructure. But if you have a look at the requirements, actually, once you declare that your infrastructure is critical, they are actually very costly for the owner of critical infrastructures. And so this high compliant cost might actually, prevent owners of critical infrastructure to be to declare them as critical infrastructures. This was also one of the main problems emerging from the cybercrime and cybersecurity bill, because the private sector was expected to contribute to national skills research and development to implement informational security standards and contribute to the protection of the national critical information infrastructure. But a number of comments by the private sector to the draft of the bill was that there were a number of requests, especially on findings and on compliance, that were falling within the private sector, and they found it very costly. And so the part of the cost for audit of a critical information infrastructure, they asked that for that part, for instance, to be reviewed, and other things, so that then the Department of Justice and Correctional Services in 2019 in October proposed to remove crimes related to critical infrastructure and rename the bill, as we have observed also before, Cybercrime Bill, resulting in this chapter 11 of the critical information infrastructure to be removed. Okay, the issue of reporting on ICT vulnerabilities in South Africa. So as I mentioned, there is a cybersecurity hub. It is possible to voluntarily report on incidents, cybercrime incidents, on vulnerabilities. But the hub is currently under-resourced, so it's not really able to tackle with maybe an increasing amount of problems reported by a number of entities. So and it seems that there is also limited information sharing about cyber incidents. There is no duty to implement specific cybersecurity measures, and also to report on cyber incidents. As I said, it's actually a voluntary practice. At the exception of the for electronic communications and service providers and financial institutions, but only in case when their IT equipment is used to commission an offense. For private companies that are listed in the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, there is this King fourth report on corporate governance for South Africa. That requires this company to oversee information and technology management by proactively monitoring cyber incidents and ensuring that their systems and processes in place are protected from a cybersecurity perspective. On the other hand, instead, the POPIA, the Act on Data Protection, Section 22, thoroughly deals with the issue of reporting data breaches. And there is an extended section, Section 22, which actually has got a number of measures on reporting on data breaches, but it only caters for data breaches. So the discussion, just very briefly on the discussion. So it seems that South Africa, what emerges that is an active participant in international cooperation debates, especially at the UN level. But the issue of protection of critical information infrastructures is fragmented, and up to a certain point is also secretive. No mechanisms to collaborate with the private sector have been identified, although they are stated everywhere. And it seems that there is an uncoordinated relation with the private sector, which is instead one of the main stakeholders on the protection of the critical infrastructure. There are difficulties to persecute without strong mechanisms for attribution, which is actually a problem that other countries are also dealing with. And therefore, there might be also problems of accountability once a cybercrime is actually committed. And it seems that the current institutional arrangement is not conducive for the protection of the critical infrastructure. So what can we recommend? How do we have to move this thing forward? So an effective cybersecurity framework, accompanied by data governance measures should be in place in the context, especially of the fourth industrial revolution. And one of the first recommendations is to conduct a cyber maturity assessment, which is a comprehensive exercise that reviews the status of policy, strategy, legislation in the country, including education programs, culture at the national level, and standards, and where the country is in terms of all these measures that should be in place to tackle cybercrime issues, including the protection of critical infrastructures. And that study allows also to identify specific points of policy intervention and to prioritize based on empirical, independent, and impartial research. Considering that the norms of the 2015 norms of the UN are voluntary and non-binding, I think it's also a very good time for South Africa to test some of these norms without hard legislation, which might become a little bit more lengthy and complicated both to adopt and to implement. There are other ways of doing that, some, for instance, regulatory sandboxes that are controlled environment and cyber simulations that would allow to test institutional arrangements and collaborative models and then to legislate on them. Cybersecurity strategy should clearly establish regulatory bodies to control, inspect, and enforce regulations with regard to critical infrastructure protection. And then I would also recommend to identify a national cyber champion, because there will be a need of coordinating all these actions. And then, of course, to leverage on existing centers that are in South Africa and also global forums that can actually provide support in terms of funding, in terms of identifying expertise, and support the overall governance of cyberspace nationally. Thank you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Colendro. I think your presentation has stimulated a lot of questions. Let me start with the first one. Let me just go here, because they were coming in as you were talking. The first question comes from Advocate Nsaluba. She's from the National Defence Force in South Africa. Thank you for the exciting exposition of critical infrastructure protection. Share with us the auditing requirements for critical infrastructure vulnerabilities and how various jurisdictions are preparing for such in relation to transversal norms and standards. And then she adds, how will the binding instruments relate to current existing ones, and how will boundary management be exercised? I think that's a mouthful, Doctor.
Yes, so that's a very complex question. As I said, there are a number of guidelines on reporting, on responsible reporting on ICT vulnerabilities. And I think it's important maybe to draw on these. I mentioned a few of them. There is the ENISA guidelines on responsible reporting on ICT vulnerabilities. More recently, the Netherlands also published a document on that, and there is the UN Department of Justice 2017 document as well. And some of them can be used as models, useful models for the drafting of national responsible disclosure policies. What's important is that we are in a phase where these global norms are, as I said, voluntary and non-binding. So it is possible actually to test them. it is possible to test the reporting on vulnerabilities to specific structures, to specific actors, and to do it in a way that is responsible. So there is time actually of doing that before maybe a binding instrument of international law would require to do it in a specific way. And by testing some of these measures, it's possible then to understand how it's possible to do them at the national level with the existing structures and processes, and what can be then recommended also at the global level in an hypothetical and possible new binding instrument, which might include also issues on response, on reporting, on responsive, on vulnerability, and yeah, responsible vulnerabilities disclosure.
All right, I see there's another question. This one comes from Interconsult 21 Global. Regarding the protection of critical infrastructure, I refer to the register law to protect the individual against abuse from the authorities. That is very important. However, how the individual is protected online criminally, is there a mechanism of warning the public from suspected online activity, companies at local and international level, kind of published and updated blacklist, enforcing, fighting, and corruption? Thank you then.
Thank you. Okay, so this is also a very interesting question. If individuals are protected against online criminality, well, now we have, as we have discussed, the cybercrime bill, and that there are some mechanisms for reporting on online crime. So for people that have been victim of different forms of cyber crimes, and it's possible to report them through the cyber hub, but as I mentioned, it's actually under-resourced, so it might be difficult for that entity to tackle with maybe an increasing number of online crime, increasing crime. And if there is a mechanism of warning public from suspected online fictive companies at the local and at an international level, that's a very interesting question. My short answer for that is that there should be in place cyber awareness programs that basically are for the overall and general public on how, you know, to protect yourself and how also to defend yourself against any fictive companies that might not, you know, exist. I think it will be interesting to have an updated and published blacklist of that, and probably if the mechanism on reporting on cybercrime is done thoroughly, it would be possible to create and to come up with some registry. But that, of course, then needs to be done in a very you know, continuous and thorough and systematic way, so that at the end it's possible to have an updated list of these fictive companies. But they will always emerge. So it's also important to try to understand that cybercrime is actually an evolving entities, is an evolving process, and as such also this kind of fictive companies. So what will be important, I think, once all these cybercrimes have been reported, is trying to analyze this evidence, try to understand, you know, what are the existing patterns, what are the how this kind of crime is perpetrated, to try to identify ways of in which, you know, different companies that might create different names are actually then perpetrating similar kind of online crime and fraud.
Thank you, Doc. There's one more question from Advocate Nzaluba from Defense. She says, critical information protection and infrastructure and MIS provisions. How do you see the convergence of cybersecurity institutionalism? And what are the inherent benefits of declaration of CRs, and how is the enforcement exercised to protect territorial integrity in terms of Section 200 and 202 of the Constitution?
Okay, so the convergence to ensure cybersecurity institutionalization. I think that as was already observed at the UN level in 2003, digitalization underpins all infrastructures. And more and more, the functioning of all infrastructures will really rely on digitalization. Not only the banking systems and our databases, but also our water utilities, as we have seen, electricity utilities already, and maybe road as well. Once maybe traffic management will be done through digital means. In that case, I think that cybersecurity should then become really, not only as a colleague, Chris Painter, saying that is still defined as a kind of boutique area, but it would be really done as a cross-cutting issues across all sectors of societies, and so also across all infrastructures. And enforcement, I think, can be done, to protect territoriality integrity only when there is clarity of law and clarity of regulation. So once responsibilities of those that own and manage their own infrastructure are clear, and it's perfectly then understandable, what should be done for what they should be doing for protecting these critical infrastructures, for reporting on vulnerabilities, for reporting on accidents, and also to identify collaborative mechanisms together with the public, private sector, and other entities to keep these infrastructures safe and secure. But until that kind of legislation which would provide certainty is not in place, I think that enforcement mechanisms would actually be difficult to be identified.
Thank you, Dr. Calandro. It looks like there's a whole lot of questions for you.
Probably it is then a priority, this critical section.
I'll just read the last comment here from Advocate Chikalanga. There's a number of critical provisions in the ECT that are yet to be implemented, which is very concerning. This boils down to two critical issues: lack of political will and lack of capacity. I also understand the hub is not very effective because of the variety of reasons, including investment into cyber security programs. I'm mostly at shock when interacting with some of the leaders in the public sectors who still think cybersecurity is a nice to have. So that was a comment. And then just lastly, from Mr. London Izweni from Cyber Hound, he says, can you please share Colendro's presentation? And he states his email address, which I want to send now for personal information. What funding instruments can access the fund for CIPF projects? And then Dr. Calandro, did you get that question?
Yes, I got it. So I would say that, okay, funds that can be accessed to improve capacity for the protection of critical infrastructure, because that's also, I believe from my perspective, one of the main issue. And there are a number of available funds, and there is an entity called the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, whose role is to put together donors, funding institutions, with requesting entities that can be both state, but also private sector organizations, if they deal, for instance, with cybersecurity issue or critical infrastructure protection. Primarily, I would say states, but I would include also other stakeholders, considering that becoming so important in this space. And they play a role of matchmaking, so between the donors community, the needs of the requesting entity, and those that can provide expertise and support for the development of capacity in specific issues, including the protection of critical infrastructure. So my advice will be to have a look at that, at the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, to really try to understand how that model works and try to get assistance from there. As I recommend at the end, I think it's really important to leverage on these existing forums, because the means, the tools are there. So I think it's why not to use them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Calandro. I think everyone knows where you are, Research ICT Africa. I'm sure this discussion is not going to end here. I think your email mailbox is going to be full, Dr. Calandro. Thank you very much for an insightful presentation. And
Thank you
let's
for
take it
having
from
me.
there. Thank you. All right, so